What we uncover today may unsettle us, but it will also empower us to learn from the past to protect our future and to ensure that transparency triumphs over secrecy. Let us proceed with the seriousness this moment demands for the sake of justice, for the memory of President Kennedy, and for the soul of our republic.
Some of the foremost experts on John F. Kennedy and his assassination back in 1963 have combed through thousands of pages of newly released and unredacted documents related to the investigation. And now they have testified about what they uncovered before a congressional committee. We're going to take a closer look at the biggest bombshells to come out of the release, according to these experts, and how the document dump may actually have done more harm than good. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, this is important. This is important because while we've certainly taken the time to break down and analyze the documents from the JFK files release here on Sidebar, we are now hearing actual testimony on Capitol Hill about all this for the first time. Yep. The House Oversight Committee's task force on the declassification of federal secrets, led by Florida Representative Anna Paulina Luna, has vowed to get to the bottom of what she calls cover-ups by the United States government. And after what could be argued to be a hurried release last month of thousands of documents related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy back in 1963 out in Dallas, the committee called witnesses to testify about the most important pieces of information that were buried in thousands of, again, what seemed to be unorganized and unlabeled files. I think that's a fair assessment. Now, the first of those witnesses was Jefferson Morley, former Washington Post reporter, author who's done tons of research into not only the assassination, but also the historical events surrounding it. He runs the blog JFK Facts on Substack, has written several books, though some scholars say that he touts so-called conspiracy theories, including that there was more than one shooter that day, which obviously differs from the conclusion reached by the Warren Commission in the years after the assassination. But also in attendance was Oliver Stone, an award-winning filmmaker who released the film JFK back in the 90s, suggested that the assassination was planned by people working in Kennedy's own government. According to ABC News, reports from the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, partially credit Stone's film with the passage of the JFK Records Act, which called for all records to be publicly disclosed. And Stone released a follow-up documentary on the assassination back in 2021, further questioning the lone gunman theory. Now, that documentary was apparently based on a book by a researcher named James DiEugenio, who also testified at this hearing. And the committee's minority party, the Democrats, also called a witness, a man named John Davison. He's senior counsel and director of litigation for a group called EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, this nonprofit that advocates for privacy rights and better oversight. And he testified about the mandate to release these files per an order from President Donald Trump, and how those reviewing documentation to make necessary and important redactions like Social Security numbers didn't have enough time to do their job properly. Okay, so now that we know all the players and why they were called, now let's get into what they had to say. In his opening remarks, Jefferson Morley acknowledged that while the public already had access to many of these files, unredacted material and some new reports offered a lot more clarity that we didn't have before.
It's a solemn responsibility to report on the disturbing new revelations that have emerged from the newest JFK files. And it is a grave matter to assert that CIA officers were culpable or complicit in the death of a president. So I want fact checkers to have all the evidence that I'm used to support my testimony today. I speak with the benefit of 3 decades of reporting on the JFK story.
Hey, I just want to take a quick sidebar from Sidebar to thank Odoo for sponsoring this episode. Now, here's the thing. Odoo is an incredible all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications, like their Projects app. We all know managing projects can be tough, but with the Odoo Projects app, it doesn't have to be. You need a clear timeline? The Gantt view maps out your tasks and helps you stay on track. Prefer a more flexible approach? The Kanban view lets you move tasks easily from to-do to done. Or if you like structure, the list view gives you all the details at a glance. Odoo's comprehensive dashboard keeps you updated on task status, activities, remaining time, so you're always in control. And with powerful reporting tools, you can keep track of your project's budget, milestones, and profitability in real time. Odoo Projects app will help you stay organized, meet deadlines, and boost productivity. So right now, you can get a free 15-day trial of Odoo's all-in-one business solution. Scan the QR code on screen or check it out at our link, odoo.com/sidebarproject. Now, according to Morley, some of the most bombshell evidence to come out of this recent release relates to the CIA and how its leadership knowingly and repeatedly lied to the Warren Commission in the years following the assassination. That's his view on this. And he gave a summary of what he found to the committee.
In the spring of 2023, the CIA fully declassified for the first time its pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin who denied killing the president and was killed himself in police custody before he could defend himself. I have a copy here of the CIA's pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm submitting it for the record. The declassified Oswald file runs to, and fact checkers can confirm this, 198 pages. In the fall of 1963, in November of 1963, this file was held in the office of James Angleton, counterintelligence chief at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, not 5 miles from the White House where President Kennedy lived and worked. To be sure, the declassified Oswald file is not a smoking gun. I showed it to journalists whose judgment I trust, and they shrugged. They said this is evidence of incompetence. CYA, they said, cover your ass. I didn't quite believe that, but I couldn't prove them wrong until March 18th. That was the day that the National Archives began posting long secret JFK assassination records that had been withheld from the public view for decades. I started by looking at 9 declassified documents about Mr. Angleton. He was the man who compiled the Oswald file. And when I came to a long secret transcript of Angleton's testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, my reservations about passing judgment on the responsibility vanished. One newly declassified passage showed that Angleton had lied under oath about his surveillance of Oswald's correspondence while he lived in the Soviet Union from 1959 to 1962. And that, for me, was a tipping point. The transcript, which the CIA withheld from public view for half a century, confirmed a disturbing fact. James Angleton is the 3rd senior CIA officer known to have lied under oath about what they knew about the alleged assassin Oswald before JFK was killed. The first was Deputy Director Richard Helms. He lied to the Warren Commission in May 1964 when he said under oath the CIA had only, quote, minimal information about Oswald before JFK was killed. 198 pages of information cannot be truthfully described as minimal. The second CIA officer who lied was George Joannides, chief of the Covert Action Branch of the Miami Station in 1963. His agents in the top-secret AMSPEL program generated propaganda about Oswald's pro-Castro activities both before and after the president was killed. 15 years later, in 1978, the CIA inserted Joannides into the House JFK investigation, and he blocked any investigation of contacts between Oswald and his AMSPEL agents. Obstructing Congress cannot be considered evidence of incompetence. And this is what I believe in summary. One false statement might be incompetence. A second false statement might be CYA for the first false statement. But 3 false statements by top CIA officers about Kennedy's accused killer, that is a pattern. It's a pattern of misconduct. It's a pattern of malfeasance. If 3 police officers lie about their knowledge of a homicide defendant, that cannot be considered exculpatory evidence. To the contrary, it shows guilty knowledge and criminal culpability. It is, in a word, incriminating.
Okay, moving on. When Oliver Stone gave his opening statement, he said the committee needs to go back to the very beginning.
I ask you in good faith, outside all political considerations, to reinvestigate the assassination of this President Kennedy from the scene of the crime to the courtroom, which never happened, but which means the chain of custody on the rifle, the bullets, the fingerprints, the autopsy that defies belief and that if it were a murder, we'd have given to the poorest man dying in a gutter. Let us reinvestigate the fingerprints of intelligence all over Lee Harvey Oswald from 1959 to 1960, his violent death in 1963. And most importantly, this CIA, whose muddy footprints are all over this case, a true interrogation.
In his opening remarks, John Davison from the Electronic Privacy Information Center called out the haphazard release without basic redactions to hide personal information.
By all appearances, these procedures and safeguards were completely bypassed in last month's hurried release of 60,000 pages from the JFK records collection, which led to the public disclosure of Social Security numbers and other private information of more than 400 former congressional staffers and other former officials, some of them still living. This shocking violation of privacy has compounded a national trauma and distracted from Congress's stated goal of informing the public through the JFK Records Act. Security experts, as well as those directly harmed by the breach, have deemed it outrageous, sloppy, unprofessional, astonishing, foolish, incompetent, egregious, almost criminal, and a breach of a first-grade elementary level rule of security. NARA has reportedly begun to reach out to individuals affected by the breach, and the White House has promised free credit monitoring services and new Social Security numbers to those affected. But these steps are too little, too late. The bell can't be unrung.
Now, according to Davison, the best way to prevent something like this from happening in the future is to avoid sudden and hurried deadline changes and to provide more funding for government employees to get this critical work done. But now I want to get back to what the researchers found buried in this trove of information. So Ranking Member Robert Garcia questioned Morley about who he thought killed the former president.
Now, we know that your research, of course, is very focused on what the U.S. government knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. I think you made that also very clear. You believe Lee Harvey Oswald fired the shots who killed President Kennedy. Is that correct, sir?
No, I don't believe that President Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy. I don't think the evidence supports that.
You don't think the evidence supports that he fired the shots?
He might have fired a gun. He was not the intellectual author of the president's death.
Okay, and I wanted to clarify, because I think the firing of the shots, I just wanted to clarify that you do believe that he fired the shots.
No, I don't.
Okay,
that has not been determined by the evidence.
Okay. Well, I want to just get you to clarify that. Now, I want to also just say a few points. You, Mr. Morley, you have said that the CIA was not forthcoming with Congress in past investigations. Correct, sir?
Yes.
Okay. I know you have said that you also you have said that CIA counterintelligence was also either new information or could have been responsible in some sort of broader plot. Is that correct, sir?
Correct.
Okay. But you have said, I think, just to correct what you said, you have said, though, that there is no direct evidence as of today that the CIA committed the assassination. Is that correct?
I would say that the fact pattern that has emerged in last month shows culpability or complicity in the president's death.
But no direct evidence. Is that correct, sir?
We have very direct evidence of the CIA's surveillance of Oswald.
No, I'm not asking about that. I agree with you, sir. I mean direct evidence that the CIA is connected to the assassination.
All of these events connect the CIA to the assassination.
I understand that, sir. I'm just telling you my interpretation of what's been presented is that I have not seen direct evidence. I'm not saying, by the way, that that the CIA or the FBI haven't been involved in a variety of covering up information in the past. We know that to be true, but I just want to make sure that I'm very clear that I have not seen direct evidence yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a few minutes later, Representative Luna questioned Morley again, this time drilling down and pressing him on who actually fired the shot that killed Kennedy.
So who do you think fired the shot?
I don't know.
You don't know, but you don't believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald?
Oswald was not the intellectual author of Kennedy's death, even if he fired a gun that day.
Who do you think was the intellectual author of Kennedy's death?
Kennedy's enemies high in his own government is as specific as I can be based on the available evidence. Probably CIA and Pentagon.
And the committee also questioned Oliver Stone and James DiEugenio about a potential critical piece of evidence that they claim they don't have and that they have seemingly been trying to get a hold of for years.
Would you recommend that the task force send a letter requesting NBC make a clear copy of the film?
Certainly, that'd be very interesting. Mr. DiEugenio and I saw a film a potential Oswald watching the motorcade go by, which means that he was downstairs at the time of the shooting, and that would be very interesting to see. We couldn't say for sure that was Oswald, but it's a man who looks like him. So I think it would be a very good idea for the task force to subpoena NBC, which has the original film.
Yes, they supposedly have the original, yeah.
They have the original film. They've refused it twice to be shown.
Yes.
And if this task force could easily get that, and the American public should have a right to judge for itself who was standing there.
Now, from there, you had Arizona Republican Congressman Eli Crane asking the witnesses about Gary Underhill. This is a man we talked about in previous sidebars. This is a man connected with the CIA who made comments about Kennedy's own administration seemingly being involved in his death. And then apparently this guy went into hiding and was found dead 6 months later, reportedly from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
As I was going through some research, one of the things that I found interesting, and please correct me if I'm mistaken here, any of you guys on the panel, but Mr. Underhill, who was a CIA agent himself, who apparently left D.C. the days after the assassination in a hurry, Gary Underhill then confided in a friend that a clique within the CIA had assassinated Kennedy. He also told his friends that he may need to leave the country and that he feared for his life. Mr. Underhill was then found dead 6 months later. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Morley. Do you find those types of stories surrounding Mr. Underhill to be credible?
Mr. Underhill was hardly alone in suspecting CIA involvement of the assassination. President Harry Truman suspected it, President Johnson suspected it, and President Richard Nixon suspected it. So I think that Gary Underhill was a man who worked in the intelligence community and was in a position to know something. His story's not confirmed, but it's consistent with what lots of other people thought.
What was his title? Do you remember, Mr. Morley?
He was not a CIA employee. He was an arms dealer who assisted CIA in acquiring weapons and, shipping them.
Do you know how he died, Mr. Morley?
I don't know anything more than was reported in the documents.
Mr. Eugenio, do you know how he died?
Eugenio.
Sorry about that.
You're not the first one.
Yeah. Do you know how he died, sir? Underhill. Mr. Underhill.
Gary Underhill. Do you know how he died?
Gary Underhill?
Yeah.
Gary Underhill his body was discovered by his friend Asher Burns, who was a magazine writer at the time. And the door was open, ajar a little, and Burns entered the room, and he thought Underhill was sleeping. But as he approached the body, he saw that there was a hole, a bullet hole in his head, all right? Asher Burns was so disgusted by the investigation that came after that he didn't even want to talk about what had happened. But one of the things about the Underhill death is that for him to have taken his own life, the gun was in the wrong hand, okay? All right, so that was one of the most puzzling things, about that particular case. Underhill has been, I believe, very much ignored, by a lot of people, and I'm glad that this memo finally got out there.
Now, the Trump administration has vowed to release more than just secret files related to JFK's assassination. There are reports on the assassination of his brother, Robert Kennedy, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. And the committee has also pushed for the Department of Justice to release any still secret files related to convicted sex offender and apparent human trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Now, some members of the committee insisted that we got to be more careful when we release information like this in the future.
I don't want this task force to get drawn too far down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole when we convene these hearings, because the reality of the CIA's past action is troubling on its own. This dump of documents alone showed evidence of illegal surveillance, break-ins, overstepping of authority. We've even got specific instructions on how to wiretap, including how to use certain chemicals to create markings on phones to tip off spies. But we already knew this was happening. We knew that the CIA committed human rights abuses and illegally surveilled people, which is why the work declassifying these documents is so important. We've got to have transparency, right? So that we can learn to do better. so that we can hold agencies accountable. But being reckless with this sensitive information is also not the way to do it. Declassifying documents around the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. is a serious matter, and we owe it to the American people to get it right. Unfortunately, the rollout of documents we've seen so far has been sloppy and rushed. The release didn't really give us a smoking gun, but it did produce a plenty of collateral damage. Trump's actions have jeopardized the safety and security of hundreds of former congressional and federal employees by releasing their social security numbers and personal information to the public. And for what? To score political points by rushing the release. Many of the people whose personal information has been exposed are rightfully afraid about their identities being stolen and about threats to their personal safety. And people identified in the documents are already being forced to get new social security numbers at a time when President Trump is literally dismantling the agency that administers them. Mr. Davison, President Trump ordered the declassification and release of tens of thousands of pages within 24 hours. Do you think that that was problematic? And if so, why?
Thank you for the question. It was. Going back to January, there, of course, was the executive order requiring the disclosure of all the records in the collection. My understanding is that the process was playing out, that the archives was conducting the review it needed to determine what few bits of these records needed to be redacted to protect, among other things, the privacy of individuals whose information was contained therein. And then that process was short-circuited. And despite awareness at the National Security Council and the archives that the disclosure of these records would cause tangible privacy harm, the rollout was conducted without redactions all the same, leading to the situation where hundreds of social security numbers have been disclosed, creating a quite scary and alarming situation for those whose numbers were implicated, who now have to rush to place freezes on their credit accounts, if they're issued new social security numbers, to update all of that information with all of their various accounts and creditors and so forth. So it is a serious issue for the people affected, and it could have been avoided with just a little bit more due diligence of the sort that the archives normally exercises.
Yeah, so is there a way that Trump could have protected that personal information?
Is there a way that the president could have protected that information? Yeah, by going through the ordinary process of reviewing these documents and dictating that these particular social security numbers and other sensitive financial pieces of information would not be disclosed with the records.
Certainly, thank you.
And Representative Luna wrapped up the 2-hour hearing by thanking the witnesses for their diligent work over the last several decades to bring truth and a better understanding to the American people.
There are those in our country who may ask why this task force seeks to pursue the truth underlying the facts surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. And the answer to that is the truth. Even the truth delayed and justice, even justice delayed, is always worth attaining. And the men and women who have sought answers regarding the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy for all the world to see have been obstructed and hampered by our own government for over 60 years. This hearing is not meant to provide a definitive explanation of the Kennedy assassination. This hearing demonstrates, however, that the CIA and other components of the federal government have not been honest with the American people that they are meant to serve up until recent efforts. And the American people must hold these agencies accountable, and they can. I've invited Mr. Stone, a filmmaker, to this hearing because he did just that, motivating Congress in the 1990s to pass a law that began the declassification process. And I'd like to applaud our president for continuing this process as he promised to do so. Researchers like Mr. Morley and Mr. DiEugenio have provided new information that helped bring light to some of the darkest days in American history. And I would like to thank the witnesses again and applaud their work. The search for truth continues, and the task force will pursue this at any price.
Now, here's the thing. Professors that we have spoken to here on Sidebar about this topic, they have said that it will likely take years before we know the full scope of the information that was released last month. As scholars and researchers, they continue to comb through these documents, make the connections. It is very confusing, so obviously it's going to take some time. You're dealing with many years, many different players. So look, we will continue to monitor new revelations as they come to light, because I will tell you, this is a fascinating historical study. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.